Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi, and this is the Introduction to Media Psychology lectures. This will be Lecture 1. What we see here is the image of horses racing. It was painted around 40,000 years ago by prehistoric humans in the Chauvet caves of France. Art historians, anthropologists, and evolutionary psychologists have described the depiction of depth and motion in early cave art. It has been described that the flickering firelight and the textured surface of the cave walls lent a sense of depth and motion to these early works of art. Here we see an eight-legged boar that gives an impression of motion even when seen with a stable light source. This is found in the cave of Altamira in Spain. Thousands of years later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Edward Muybridge would do with photography what the Paleolithic artists did with paint. Here we see an image of a painting from 1912 by Marcel Duchamp entitled Nude Descending the Staircase No. 2. And here we see a photograph by Jean Milly entitled Stroboscopic Study of Nude Descending Staircase from 1942. Perhaps one of the most curious images is found in the Lascaux caves of France dating to about 17,000 years ago. This is a painting of a horse that has been drawn upside down. Although many theories have been put forth as to why this horse appears upside down, the most interesting might be one proposed by artist and researcher Matt Gatton. These images were taken from Gatton's fieldwork in which he turned a cave into a camera obscura, the predecessor of the modern camera. Sealing the cave entrance with an animal hide, with only a small pinhole in the center, results in the image being projected onto the cave wall upside down. Although Aristotle describes the camera obscura, also known as the pinhole camera, it is not until the 17th century that the technology is formalized. Here we see a photograph of a camera obscura image of the Brooklyn Bridge projected through a pinhole in a New York City apartment by photographer Abelardo Morel. The back and forth leaping through history shows a persistence in theme and a change in technology. Although the media changes from paints and rock walls to canvas and later chemical reactions to light, the themes of motion and depth, time and space remain constant throughout history. By the late 18th century, we begin to see various surfaces coated with light-sensitive chemicals, which will evolve into the modern camera film. Here we see the first photograph taken in 1826 by the French inventor Joseph Nicephore Niepce, entitled View from the Window at La Grasse. The similarities between the camera and the human eye are compelling, each consisting of a lens, a dark chamber, and a light-sensitive surface. The animal eye and the camera function in nearly an identical fashion. Both project reflected light onto a two-dimensional surface. The human retina is a thin sheet of light-sensitive neural tissue that is reactive to light wave frequency and intensity. The nerve endings are sensitive to frequency called cones, and the receptor nerves that are sensitive to intensity are called rods. After the nerve cells are stimulated, the neural impulses are turned into brain language through a process called transduction. Once delivered to the brain, the wave frequency is perceived as color and the wave intensity is perceived as brightness. This is not too dissimilar from the thousands of light-sensitive pixels that make up a sensor in a digital camera. Until the raw data of zeros and ones are processed into JPEG or TIFF files, they remain merely a series of on and off sequences. By the 1860s, the new psychologists were already investigating the phenomenon of sensation and perception. Gustav Fechner, Hugo Munsterberg, Wilhelm Wundt, and William James all investigated the mental processing of three-dimensional representation on two-dimensional surface. However, it was not until 1910 that a Bohemian psychologist named Max Wertheimer would make perception the main focus of scientific psychology, developing what would come to be known as the Gestalt school of psychology. The early investigation into how we come to experience space on a flat 3D surface was developed by artists and later adopted by psychologists. Since the 14th century, artists had been using linear perspective to add a sense of depth into their paintings. The Florentine painter Filippo Brunelleschi is thought to be the first to use linear perspective. In his 1450 painting, The Baptistery in Florence. The 7 rules that student artists learn to make 3-dimensional representations on 2-dimensional surface, linear perspective, shading, interposition, relative size, aerial perspective, elevation, and textural gradient, were adopted and systematized by perception psychologists. The term linear perspective begins to appear in publications around the year 1780. By the 1940s, the term monocular depth cues become widespread in Gestalt publications. The riddle of how the mind organizes and perceives space was piqued by the technology of the time: drawing, painting, and photography. By the late 1800s, the mechanical photographic reproduction of reality served to transform and throw into uncertainty the very meaning, value, and role of art and the artist. The traditional modern evaluation of art through accuracy and depiction was obsolesced by the mechanical camera. It was at this point when art shifted into subjective experience rather than objective depiction. It was around this time that 2 inventors, sons of a photographer, Auguste and Louis Lumière, became interested in the question of motion and time. The idea that presenting rapidly successive images would result in the illusion of movement was not new. Utilizing the industrial technology of the sewing machine, the brothers Lumière managed to develop a camera that would simultaneously advance a strip of film while opening and closing the shutter. On December 28, 1895, in a small basement room called Le Salon Indien beneath the Grand Café in Paris, the first public performance of a motion picture was held. A legend holds that when one of the 10 50-second films ran, a film depicting the arrival of a train at the Gare de la Ciotat, the audience became panicked and attempted to escape the salon as the train appeared to be crashing through the wall. Only 5 years later, the Eiffel Tower would be unveiled at the 1900 World's Fair. Near the tower, a photographer and stage magician named Raoul Grémont-Sanson presented the first virtual reality theater. Using 10 Lumière cameras attached to a hot air balloon, a 360-degree shot of Paris was recorded as the balloon rose 400 meters above the city. Grémont-Sanson then constructed a theater that consisted of a platform, hot air balloon facade, and a 360-degree screen. For 3 days, audiences eagerly flocked to the display until the fire police shut it down for fear that the hot projectors would start a blaze. In the 1950s, Disney recreated a theater similar to the 1900 Cinerama that continues to attract visitors today. While Russian filmmaker Lev Kuleshov was applying the experimental method to audience reactions of montage editing, today this is called the Kuleshov effect, psychologist Max Wertheimer was sitting on a train considering the phenomenon of experiencing motion through the movement of a second train while he was stationary. This prompted him to purchase a stroboscope at the next stop. Stroboscope was a novelty toy that depicted motion. By 1912, he had conducted extensive research resulting in the publication of experimental studies in the perception of movement. The Gestalt psychologists made the mental processes of escapism of cinema the the perception of artificial production of space and time was through cinematic motion pictures was being explored by the Gestalt psychologists. One of Wertheimer's graduate students in Berlin, Rudolf Arnheim, would go on to be the foremost psychologist on art, architecture, and film, what we would one day call media psychology. In 1957, Arnheim would write the classic Gestalt text on cinema, film as art. The first generation of Gestalt psychologists were initially interested in issues of sound, vision, tactile, olfactory, gustatory perception. In his text, The Story of Psychology, Robert Bowles describes the Gestaltists as a small militant band of psychologists that rejected the idea should be broken up into little elements of sensation. The Gestaltists were so out of step with the rest of experimental psychology that they seemed to have no chance of making a mark on it. Nonetheless, they had a great impact. What Bowles describes here is the Gestaltist incorporation of phenomenology into scientific psychology. Phenomenology is an approach to understanding experiences as an interaction between the physical and metaphysical thought world. The term Gestalt refers to meaning coming from context, both physical and psychical framing. Karl Stumpf was a phenomenologist and teacher of the first generation of the Gestalt psychologists. We're going to keep phenomenology in mind because it will re-enter the story of media psychology in a very important way. But let us now take a look at the second generation of Gestaltists. Kurt Lewin, who had also studied with Stumpf, was a Gestalt psychologist who was interested in social interaction and the power of motivation and context on people's thinking, feeling, and behaving. After escaping Nazi Germany, Lewin came to the United States where he began research on the way political systems shape personality and social functioning, as well as how propaganda influences the masses. Lewin is credited with being the founder of social psychology, which, in the Gestalt spirit, investigates the influence of the context on the individual. By the 1920s, many of the exiled psychologists from Nazi-occupied Europe practiced a psychology that was in opposition to the American behaviorism that was dominating the field. This came to be known as social psychology. Social influences of mass media became a central research question for these psychologists. In 1937, a group of social research thinkers were gathered at Princeton University to form the Radio Project, which set out to investigate the effects of mass media on audiences. Intellectual luminaries including Paul Lazarsfeld, Gordon Allport, Hadley Cantrill, and Theodore Adorno all had been influenced by phenomenology, Marxist psychology, and psychoanalysis, or all three. Their most famous investigation came in 1938 when radio man Orson Welles presented a radio drama by the author H.G. Wells based on the book The War of the Worlds. The group's research found that 25% of the 6 million listeners thought that the New Jersey farmlands had actually been invaded by Martians. The Stanton-Lazarsfeld Program Analyzer was one of the tools developed to measure audience reaction to programming that came out of the Princeton lab. Studying the effect that mass media had on audience members became the main focus of social scientists. Devices that measured the biological or perceptual reaction appeared so that audience reaction could be quantified and statistically analyzed. As early as 1906, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung was experimenting with the galvanic skin response, the GSR, to stimulus. The EEG, the electroencephalograph, appeared in the 1870s, and electrical activity of the brain was a research in Europe and Russia was extensively looked at through the 1900s. By the 1950s, the Czech psychologist Kurt Freund introduced the penile and vaginal plethysmograph, which were developed to measure sexual arousal to the media. Media effects research quickly became the standard way of researching media in psychology. the pursuit for a clear cause and effect relationship between what someone watched and how it affected them was the predominant goal. Psychology itself was divided between the Gestalt movement, psychoanalysis, and the dominant paradigm of American behaviorism. One of the members of the radio project, Theodor Adorno, was skeptical of the preoccupation with cause and effect studies. Coming from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, he brought a tradition of psychoanalytic and Marxist analysis to culture and media. The Frankfurt School, as it is called, was originally housed at the University of Frankfurt in Germany. Established in the 1920s, it became the home for a group of radical intellectuals who were interested in the political, economic, and psychological theories of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Critical theory emigrated to America when the Frankfurt School was Frankfurt School was housed in exile from Nazi Germany in New York City. Its best-known researchers formed an interdisciplinary mix and included luminaries such as Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Leo Lowenthal, and Theodor Adorno. The critical theorists rejected the surface-level cause and effect relationships of culture and personality, and investigated the overdetermination of psyche and society. Drawing on Freudian concepts of the conscious and unconscious, and Marxist concepts of the superstructure and the substructure, the Frankfurt School developed an intellectual, theoretical, and active analysis of media and culture. The approach to media diverged at this point, resulting in two different schools: critical media studies and media effects studies. Later, critical media studies would become cultural media studies. The critical theory approach differentiates knowledge as coming from either sensory experience or symbolic context. All symbolic knowledge comes to us through a medium. The etymological root of the word medium is the Latin medius, which means middle. A medium, then, is anything that comes between. This can be the body, it can be architecture, it can be art, language, written text, music, television, radio, newspaper. Anything can be a medium. As it is defined by Ott and Mack in Critical Media Studies, an introduction, critical media studies is about the social and cultural consequences of the mass media. Mass media can be differentiated from personal media by the ability to present the message to large groups of people. Ott and Mack further describe mass media as those communication technologies that have the potential to reach large audiences in remote locations. Simply put, mass media collapses space and transcends physical distance. Mass media are communication technologies that have the potential to reach a large audience in remote locations. Mass media, is defined by Robert Campbell et al., is distinguished as the cultural industries, the channels of communication that produce and distribute songs, novels, news, movies, online computer services, and other cultural products to a large number of people. W. James Potter, in his book Media Literacy, defines mass communication as one-way communications from media organizations to members of the mass media. He further defines mass audiences as old conceptualization of the media audience as being very large, composed of all kinds of people who are anonymous and interchangeable. Within the audience, there is no social organization or interaction amongst audience members. The term mass media begins to appear around 1940. The etymology of the word mass has three distinctions. One is a verb use, from the French masser, to gather together. The noun use, kneaded dough, lump, that which adheres together like dough, from the Latin massa. And another noun form, from the Latin missa, which refers to the Eucharist service and derives from the meaning dismissal. These etymologies lend a certain insight into the function of mass as a verb and as a noun. In particular, The idea of mass as a kneaded dough seems to describe a function of the media on the audience. Mass media is typically categorized into traditional and new media. New media refers to a digital-based media that is available on demand and is typically interactive. Traditional media, also known as old media or legacy media, refers to television, radio, film, music, newspaper, magazines, books, and print publications. Typically, media thinkers distinguish between print media, broadcast media, motion picture, sound recording, and new media. Prior to 1450, information was transmitted primarily orally or through texts that were hand-copied by scribes. In the year 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented the first mass medium, the movable type printing press. Quote, "Suddenly, knowledge could be recorded for future generations in libraries or religious texts, and social power increasingly hinged upon the literacy and ownership of printed materials. Most importantly, the press allowed for an unprecedented circulation of knowledge to far-flung cities across Europe. Although still limited by class distinctions, access to information from outside of one's immediate context was a real possibility." That's from Otten Mack. This critical analysis of the printing press describes the technology not merely as a convenience, but as a social, political, and economic game changer. If knowledge is power, then the introduction of the mass-produced, mechanized media reproduction was an event that had dramatic bearing on who controlled whom and what. Central to critical media study is the context in which information and technologies exist. This can be described as either a synchronic, present context, meaning, or a diachronic, historically evolving meaning. As semiotician Theo van Leeuwen points out, if we do not consider things diachronically, we find ourselves seeing things as part of a seemingly natural order rather than invented for a reason that no longer exists. As is true for the behaviors that worked in childhood and are maladaptive in adulthood, understanding media in historical context is an essential attribute of critical theory. Because critical theory presupposes an exhaustive contextual knowledge of the phenomenon being explored, we will briefly outline the major historical evolution of the mass media. Efforts towards social change and political revolution have always utilized media. With the advent of the printing press, mass-produced pamphlets, books, newspapers, and magazines served to promote the causes of different efforts towards change. We will briefly examine the role of the printing press in the New World and how it served as a tool for revolution that would result in an uprising and overthrowing of the established colonial governments. By 1640, only 33 years after the first American settlement at Jamestown, a printing press was established in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The printed material was largely religious pamphlets. Boston printer Benjamin Harris published the first colonial newspaper, Public Occurrences, in 1690. The first issue reported that the King of France had an affair with his son's wife and took a negative tone towards British rule. The newspaper was banned after the first issue. Benjamin Franklin began a publishing house in Philadelphia, which produced the popular Poor Richard's Almanac from 1733 to 1757. The first mass circulation newspaper, the New York Sun, arrived in 1833. When newspapers began receiving funding from political parties and wealthy elites, the industry exploded. The first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, ran from 1827 through 1829 and spoke out against the racism that existed in most major newspapers. By 1973, the U.S. newspaper industry had reached a circulation of 63 million copies per day. According to Otten Mack, this constituted 92% of U.S. households receiving a daily newspaper. By 2005, only 49% of U.S. households received daily newspapers, and the circulation shrunk to around 55.3 million. Although magazine circulation have experienced a similar decline, books remain a very strong market. According to Ott and Mack, an estimated 3 million books were sold to the U.S. in 2005. The histories of the politics and economics of the print, cinema, sound, recording, and broadcast industries are extensive and exhaustive, an academic discipline of its own. Critical media studies experts are well versed in their histories and their current states. Traditional media was born in the age described as modernity, roughly the time period from the Enlightenment through the World War I. Modernity carried with it an attitude strongly rooted in the Enlightenment belief in lawful grand narratives and the trust that science and technology would conquer all struggles against nature. This attitude of modernity began to be questioned after the atrocities of a technological mechanical war. Rumblings amongst the technological attitude of modernity. By the end of World War II, the American atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone killed between 150,000 and 246,000 people. The belief in the good of science and technology, as well as in the grand narrative of the Enlightenment, was over. The postmodern age had arrived, an attitude that was fractured after and against modernity. Postmodernity is interested in histories rather than history, a disruption of traditional grand narratives, economic and political systems. It engages structures of power and is interested in information rather than knowledge. Ott and Mack propose 5 key trends in the postmodern mediated world: globalization, convergence, mobility, fragmentation, and simulation. The way in which information is changed between modernity and postmodernity. The primary economic commodity shifted from a goods-based to an information-based service economy. The goods market has become a highly customizable, tailored market that relies on technology to allow consumers, the postmodern customer, to personalize their cars, movies, music playlists, and even their college education. If modernity culminated in the Industrial Age, a time of plentiful, identical, mechanically reproduced goods, postmodernity is the age of personalized, immediate, mass availability. The delivery system is primarily electronic. The first characteristic of postmodernity is a commonly used word: globalization. The term refers to removal of boundaries that interfere with exchange. Information, which is the commodity of the postmodern, is not limited to physical barriers and can be made available to anyone who have a transmitter or a receiver, devices like a smartphone, a computer, etc. In the modern, there were physical boundaries. Some still exist today. Today, boundaries are often non-material, in the forms of laws, firewalls, and agreements. Free trade agreements such as NAFTA have opened the world into a global market, one in which all people who have the resources to do so can enter into the conversation. A deconstruction of place and time occurs with the digital technology, one in which location is less important than presence. In the postmodern globalized world, there is great opportunity for exchange. However, there are some real costs as well. Critical theory analyzes these negative effects closely. One concern of globalization is cultural imperialism, the imposition of one set of cultural values on other cultures. Here we see examples of cultural imperialism when a dominant culture affects another culture unidirectionally. The idea of the postmodern world becoming a homogenized simulacra, a place where every town becomes a copy for which there is no original. We can get a sense of this today in most American towns. This is a downtown that did not exist only 10 years ago. A copy of an idealized downtown America, designed exclusively for commerce. This is not an organic, homegrown downtown, but rather a simulated copy of an ideal, commercial downtown. It is sanitized, homogenized, samphorized, and pasteurized. This is the ideal postmodern downtown. In 1977, Philadelphia architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown published a book that is seminal to the postmodern condition. In Learning from Las Vegas, Venturi and Scott Brown outlined the future of postmodern America, and they predicted that the Las Vegas Strip was the model. Billboards, street signs, and marquees become sculpture in the postmodern. Here we see a Venturi hospital in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. The entranceway plays on the H symbol, signifying hospital, transformed into an entrance pavilion. The concept of simulation was introduced by French theorist Jean Baudrillard. In his 1981 text, Simulacra and Simulation, Baudrillard defines simulation as the generation by modes of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The point here is that media does not represent reality, but rather media recreates a hyperreality that is of its own synergistic reproduction. In the spirit of the Enlightenment, modernity, a science of categorization, the preoccupation was with separation, differentiation, and boundaries. We see this in the academic system in which courses and departments rigidly remain inside the arbitrary definitions of their tradition. The concept of interdisciplinarity, or transdisciplinary studies, has replaced the old insider view of knowledge. In the current generation, students will transform the nature of where and how information is delivered and organized into knowledge, largely due to their curiosity and their open access to a nonlinear information system. In his seminal 1979 text, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, the French theorist Jean-François Lyotard described the new commodification, categorization, and systematization of information into knowledges, replacing the modern worldview of linearity and knowledge branching from a central trunk of a tree. We enter a nonlinear world of rhizomatic, centerless nodes of information. Classical Newtonian mechanics has given way to chaos theory and dynamic systems of overdetermination. In critical theory, the existing boundaries are closely scrutinized and considered outside their contextual language game or system of knowledge, rather than from within it. If boundaries were the hallmark of modernity, convergence is a hallmark of postmodernity. Technology convergence can be found in your pocket on your smartphone. What required multiple devices only 10 years ago has now converged into one universal device capable of functioning in multiple ways. The postmodern world is one of multifunction rather than single-function devices. We see many of the themes of postmodern theory in the work of the street artist Banksy. Critical theory of the media is skeptical, political, and socially active. It has roots in Marxist and Freudian theory and serves as a hot academic subject. It aims towards social change. A defining example of critical theory is its use of the term theory rather than philosophy. Philosophy has traditionally viewed itself as an endeavor towards truth. Critical theory and the postmodern perspective reject ultimate truths and instead speak of contextual truths. I distinguish between big T truth and little t truth by using the capital or lowercase t. This is an important distinction to understand because it bears on our understanding of what psychology is and how it is done. The etymology of the term psychology is psyche logos, or psyche logos. Psyche derives from the Greek word soul, and logos from the Greek word word. Taken in this light, the word psychology means words or discourse on the soul. Psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim offered a sensitive account of the word psyche, specifically Sigmund Freud's choice of the word over the German word Denken, mind. He even chose the German Seele, soul, in places. The important consideration here is that there is a fundamental difference between mind and soul. Beyond the romantic or theological remnants of soul, there is a semantic significance. Psyche encompasses a much broader aspect of the human condition than mere mental processes. Logos has its own peculiar story. The first paragraph of the Gospel of John reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The significance of the word logos as God, Greek thea, is not that God spoke words, but rather that the Word is God. Taken in this light, we can understand the thought of Martin Heidegger, who said, "Man acts as though he were the shaper and master of language, while in fact language remains the master of man." Psyche logos is a symbolic discourse on the soul. It has been said that a simple translation of the word soul into the word mind turns the works of Plato into a textbook of psychology. The word mind comes into use during the Enlightenment and corresponding scientific revolution of the 17th century. It was at this time that the new Enlightenment zeitgeist distanced itself from the Dark Ages and faith in the metaphysical. Logic, mathematics, reason, and science would replace the previous world of mystic spirituality. At this time, the term psyche shifted from soul to mind, eventually evolving to the current definition of the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. The definition of psychology is not stable and has changed a number of times since 1879. When Wundt's lab and program was established in Leipzig, the founding school was called voluntarism. Since its inception, scientific psychology has been a collection of competing schools of thought, each with their own definition and view of the field. The science of mental processes definition reflects the cognitive paradigm, which has dominated the political and economical field of psychology since the 1960s. In his 1962 treatise on the nature of science, Thomas Kuhn showed us that science was not so much a method as it is a political and social institution. If it has taken science nearly 40 years to embrace Kuhn's vision, perhaps it will take another 4 decades to embrace the radical vision of science described by Paul Feyerabend, who proposed an anarchistic method without rules. The word science derives from the Latin scientia, which simply means knowledge. Any imagery of Bunsen burners and white lab coats are a cultural artifact of the 19th century and early 20th centuries. Postmodern theoretical science knows fewer limitations than did 17th century Newtonian science. Today, the emphasis is on theory and interdisciplinarity. The hostile dialectic that made up much of 20th century psychology between empiricists and naturalists, philosophers and experimentalists, psychoanalysts and humanists, behaviorists and everyone else, has come to a sudden halt. An unexpected arrival has not disrupted but unified the 7 schools: biological, cognitive, psychodynamic, existential, phenomenological, evolutionary, and behavioral psychologies into one. That unexpected arrival was neuroscience. Functioning largely outside of the psychology departments, neuroscience has become the truly transdisciplinary unifying agent that is not bogged down by the historical hostilities of the psychologies. A time may come when we see academic psychology either disappear or refer exclusively to therapeutic psychology. If this happens, it will take merely a generation of students who wish to embrace the broader perspective of neuroscience rather than the rigid infighting of psychology. How media psychology is done is as broad and inclusive as neuroscience itself. Media psychologists utilize both quantitative and qualitative research methods. We will summarize these methods, offering them as a review rather than as an introduction. Quantitative methods of research include the experimental method, correlational studies, survey, and biological research. These methods rely largely on statistical analysis and result in a coefficient that can be utilized in reporting data. Qualitative research includes archival research, interview, participant and natural observation, as well as ethnographies, critical analysis, phenomenological reduction, and semiotic analysis. These methods of research will be explored in future lectures in which examples of research will be given. 4 forms of research in particular should be mentioned, because they are so prevalent in media effects research. These are meta-studies, content analysis, longitudinal, and cross-sectional studies. These will be discussed in detail based on research and relevant issues. One of the goals outlined by the American Psychological Association's Division 46, Media Psychology and Technology, is to promote media literacy. Media literacy is a basic goal of media studies, critical theory, and media psychology. We will spend a good deal of time in these lectures exploring media literacy. Most of the information that we will learn was compiled by W. James Potter in his text Media Literacy 6th edition. Potter's research has served as a standard in media studies since its publication in 1998. Potter's texts bring up-to-date information on media economics and media politics, as well as a thoughtful analysis of understanding media markets and their influence on individuals and groups. Media literacy is an important grounding for a psychology of the media, a ground that gives meaning to the figure. In 2007, the 52nd Art Biennale was held in Venice, Italy. The Russian pavilion featured an installation piece called Media Shower by Alexander Pomarev and Arseny Masharyakov. The press release described the installation as an installation tiled with monitors that simultaneously broadcast 1,000 TV channels from around the world, demonstrates the absolute dominance of mass media, a medium that traps people in an information cell. 2 switches in the shower change the on-screen content, allowing the viewer to choose breaking news, sports, commercials, pornography, nature programs, and so on. However, the shower cannot be turned off. Shower does exactly what installation art sets out to do. It brings a visceral and immediate awareness of the massive media saturation that we experience nearly every moment of our waking lives. An estimated 130 million books have been published, with about 1,500 new titles being published each day. Radio produces 65.5 million hours of new programming each year, while television broadcasts 48 million hours of new programming. Magazines, newspapers, film, and other forms of traditional media contribute to a staggering amount of information communication. However, compared to new media, this is minuscule. According to Potter, more information has been generated since you were born than the sum total of all information throughout all recorded history up until the time of your birth. The very nature of digital media allows for immense volumes of immediate production and distribution. There are nearly 2 billion internet users, about 1/3 the world's population, and 4/5 of the U.S. population, producing about 300 billion emails per day. YouTube alone streams over 1 billion videos every day. the average child is exposed to about 7.5 hours worth of electronic media per day in just 5.5 hours' time. Due to this multitasking nature of electronic media, the media exposure has become compressed and concentrated. Considering the benefits and costs of this level of media exposure is one of the goals of media literacy. The benefits are often easy to identify, such as access to vast amounts of information, entertainment, and social communications, as well as increased financial opportunities for entrepreneurs, employers, and employees. But with this volume of information, it becomes vital that individuals understand how to selectively and intelligently weigh the value and meaning of the information that is being directed at them. Another issue of media literacy is understanding how we cognitively process these vast amounts of information. Some media consumption is attended to with volitional, active concentration, but this is not the only way that information enters into our minds. Automaticity unconsciously refers to the automatic processing of stimulus. At any given time, we are consciously and unconsciously sifting through the processing vast amounts of information. This automatically manifests itself in behavior when we go on autopilot and rely on habitual rather than volitional action. Media researchers call this automatic routines. In his 1964 text, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan described media as either hot or cool. A hot medium was one that primarily engaged one sense and required very little active cognitive participation. A cool medium required thought to process and a higher degree of participation. For McLuhan, the message was not as impacting on the individual than was the medium itself. McLuhan's radical perspective of media literacy will play an important role in our exploration of the mediated world. Potter outlines 3 building blocks of media literacy. These are personal locus, knowledge structures, and skills. Development of these 3 qualities in ourselves and others will greatly enrich our media consumption and media production. Awareness of our personal locus of control includes our conscious and unconscious motivation for consuming and producing media, the acknowledged and unacknowledged goal of our effort, and the intensity of our drive for information. Awareness of how media affects oneself is fundamental for media literacy. Individuals who have an internal locus of control view themselves as directing agent in their lives and are less influenced by media. An external locus of control is characteristic of an individual who has low awareness of their own volition and autonomy and is easily directed by the environment. Determining one's personal locus is the first step of media literacy. Understanding structures of knowledge is the second essential aspect of media literacy. Differentiating between information and knowledge and an awareness of how our Weltanschauung, our worldview, and cognitive framing organizes information into knowledge will be explored in depth in this course. For now, we will simply describe this as how our organizing Gestalt transforms thinking into knowing. Media psychologists differentiate between messages, factual information, and social information. As Potter explains, messages are composed of 2 kinds of information, factual and social. A fact is something raw, unprocessed, and context-free. Social information is composed of accepted beliefs that cannot be verified by authorities in the same way that factual information can be. The issue of knowledge as power, authority, and information is an issue in critical theory that will be explored as well. The final building block of media literacy is skills. Potter describes 7 skills of media literacy: analysis, evaluation, grouping, induction, deduction, synthesis, and abstracting. Analysis simply refers to an inspection of the details of a media event and thinking on how those details interrelate, forming a larger Gestalt. Evaluation involves weighing the value and effect on an elemental detail of the whole. Grouping refers to understanding how different details interrelate and fit together. Induction builds a theory out of examples. Deduction finds examples through a theory. Synthesis refers to assembling elements into a new structure, and abstraction refers to capturing the overall essence of a media event. Working towards an attitude of sensitivity and inquisitiveness, of skeptical questioning, or personal awareness of one's point of view, the economic and political structures of knowing, and the 7 tools of doing media analysis sums up what it means to be media literate. The result is an intelligent and aware interaction with media messages, and those who produce and distribute those messages. Whether or not Marshall McLuhan could have foreseen the rise of neuroscience, a discipline that would come to fulfill his vision of media studies, and the fall of psychology is undeterminable. However, one thing seems certain. C.P. Snow's call for a third culture, one that synthesizes sciences and the humanities, has appeared. Viewing media as the extension of man, we come to understand ourselves as technology, as an electrical medium, hardwired bioelectrical systems, mental processors. The convergence of evolutionary, biological, and cognitive psychology has occurred not from within psychology but from outside of the discipline. The edge has become the digital presence of this third culture of thinkers. In 2011, literary agent and founder of theedge.org, John Brockman, wrote a text entitled, "Is the Internet Changing the Way You Think? The Net's Impact on Our Minds and Future." A compilation of 150 answers to the question from some of the luminary thinkers of today. According to Michael Marion, director of Global Foresight Books, there have been 13 books published since 2010 which decry the Internet as the end of thinking to one degree or another. Included in those 13 books is the New York Times bestseller and Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, by Nicholas Carr. This is a book we are reading in this course. I propose the relevant question is not, is the Internet changing the way we think, but rather, is the change adaptive or maladaptive to our environment? My way of thinking is based less on what is the best kind of thinking and more in what is the best thinking in a given environment. Evolutionary psychology refers to this as the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. The basic principle of evolutionary theory states that there is no best in and of itself, only the best in a given environment. Playing this line of thought out, we can see that the best way of thinking in the environment of the future will be the one that is favored. The successful adaptability of our species is mostly due to our consciousness, our ability to foresee, strategize, and plan ahead, and our ability to create and utilize technology. In gestation and infancy, large amounts of resources are spent on the development of our nervous systems. We are born altricial, due to our heads comprising 1/4 of the entire infant's body. Like primates, we have extraordinarily large frontal lobes. The latest areas of the brain to evolve, the frontal lobes, allow the strategic planning that we use to successfully manipulate our environment to suit our needs and desires. Nick Humphrey called this Machiavellian Intelligence, our ability to socially manipulate others for resources. The key to evolutionary thinking is adaptability. Adaptability means survivability, both day-to-day survival and generational survival through sexual reproduction. Our personality, intelligences, creativity, language, and thoughts are all the most favorable attributes for survival in the previous generations Environment. How well we adapt to this generation will determine our survivability. Adaptability is not only reflected on the social and personal level, it is also observable on the biological level. If we imagine that we can observe phenomenon changing on different levels, we come to understand that we are not seeing different phenomenon, but rather different levels of the same phenomenon. For example, let's imagine an inverted pyramid. We can view social interaction at the top of the upside-down triangle and cellular level biological psychology at the bottom. This clearly shows that when we look at any phenomenon, we can understand it at different levels, but not as different phenomenon. It also means that we are not trapped in a smaller cause and bigger effect linear trap. We can understand levels of correlation, not causation. In media psychology, we can observe a phenomenon at both the social and the cellular level. In between is a variety of considerations that make up what we call psychology: thinking, feeling, morality, personality. We can also see that each level is considered from other disciplines as well: anthropology, archaeology, and history, to chemistry and physics. Our exploration of the neuroscience of media and technology will be a fluid motion going back and forth between the social, historical, and chemical cellular levels of the phenomenon. The aim here is to avoid the reductionistic and mechanistic trap, and rather understand a fluid, multidimensional play in the organization of the biological flow and social levels. What I am describing here is not new. The idea that the brain changes with experience and experience changes the brain alteration is firmly established. Brain damage is reflected on the social level, and social damage is reflected on the cellular level. Every act of thinking is a disruption of the old behavioral, cognitive, and neurological habits. William James, in his 1890 Principles of Psychology, wrote on the plasticity of the nervous tissue. Today we have conclusive evidence that learning changes the brain. It's called neuroplasticity. James points out that either outward forces or inward tensions can, from one hour to another, turn that structure into something different from what it was. The act of learning is an act of violence, a rearranging of our neural connections. James wrote extensively on habit. If we consider that environment is both spatial, temporal, survivability depends on the adaptation to a specific place at a specific historical time. We can begin to see how habits form and how they can come to be considered good, we say adaptive, or bad, maladaptive. Carr, in his book, describes the British biologist J.Z. Young as an early advocate of the concept of neuroplasticity. There is evidence, he writes, that all the cells of our brains literally develop and grow bigger with use, and atrophy or waste away with disuse. Donald Hebb, a Canadian pioneer in neuroplasticity research, proposed a biological theory of learning that is frequently expressed as cells that fire together, wire together. When certain external bottom-up processing or internal top-down processing stimulus is repeatedly encountered, the neural pathways become thicker and bundles of circuitry establishes effortless, thoughtless thinking and acting. James called it habit. Breaking habits of thought or behavior takes a great effort, and on the cellular level is reflected as a kind of rewiring of the brain. A brain can be rewired, which results in behavior change, as in brain damaged Alzheimer's patients, or it can be behavior that can be effortfully changed, which results in new neural circuitry. Hebb's learning theory remains one of the most compelling and useful theories of what habit looks like at the cellular level. To fully appreciate the neuroscientific research that we will be considering, let's have a brief review of biological psychology. The body is understood as three communication systems: the nervous, endocrine, and genetic systems. The three defining characteristics of the nervous system are that it is electric, specific, and fast. The three defining characteristics of the endocrine system is that it is chemical, general, and slow. The genetic system will not be addressed in this lecture. Traditionally, meaning it was put into place during modernity, we organize the nervous system in a linear tree model. The nervous system is subdivided into two interrelated systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the spinal cord and the brain. The peripheral nervous system consists of all of the nerves that go between the brain and the organs and the muscles. The PNS is divided into the Synaptic Division and the Autonomic Division. The Synaptic Division is made up of the motor neurons to the muscles from the brain and the sensory neurons from the sense organs to the brain. The Autonomic Division deals with internal body organs of heart rate, respiration, and arousal. The Autonomic Division prepares us for the fight or flight response, further divided into two functions. The Autonomic Division has a sympathetic, arousing, and a parasympathetic, calming function. The nervous system is made up of different types of nerve cells and glial cells. The majority of the nervous system tissue is made up of glial cells. Glial is glue in Latin, and it serves as a sort of solidifying jelly that secures and stabilizes nerve cells. It is almost as if the nerve cells swim within the glial cells. Nerve cells are typically categorized as motor from the brain, sensory to the brain, or interneurons communicating between neurons. Each is a unidirectional electrical system. A neuron is receptive to a specific stimulus which literally stimulates it, building an energy reserve not unlike stretching a rubber band ready to fire. This readiness for firing is called action potential. Sensory nerves build action potential through sound or light wave stimuli, audio and visual senses, pressure or temperature stimuli, which is the tactile sense, or chemical particles, which is the olfactory and the gustatory senses. Other nerve cells, motor and interneurons, are sensitive to chemical stimulation. When a nerve cell reaches a certain level of potential through stimulation, it fires. Firing results in an electrical charge traveling through the neuron but not outside of it. The chemical packets in the axon terminals which release chemicals are called the axon buttons. These chemicals, called neurotransmitters, are released into the small gap called the synapse between one neuron and the interneuron. One of 60 different neurotransmitters will activate the next neuron in a similar way, resulting in a neural chain of communications. Some neurons, although microscopic, can be as long as 1 meter from soma to axon terminal. These neural connections are the cellular representation of what we call thinking, feeling, and behaving on the social levels. Neurotransmitters are chemical substances that are also called hormones. When the chemical particle is functioning within the nervous system, it is called a neurotransmitter, such as epinephrine. When the same chemical substance is traveling from glands through the bloodstream and affecting other organs, it is called a hormone, such as adrenaline. The endocrine system is comprised of these gland-producing hormones which travel through the circulatory system. Infants are born with between 100 and 200 billion neurons. In gestation, cell division creates 250,000 nerve cells per minute. The newborn has many neurons but few neural connections. The connections between neurons occur as we learn. One adult neuron can have over 5,000 connections. The newborn brain begins very plastic, forming neural connections that are repeatedly used and eliminating neural areas that are not used. This process is called synaptic pruning. Neural connections that are used become stronger, neural connections that are not used are eliminated. The extreme plasticity of the infant brain results in critical periods when the child is primed to learn or develop a certain social or cognitive task, such as language acquisition. Although different brains have different developmental similarities, the specific development depends on the interaction with an individual brain in an individual environment. Thinking comes from associations rather than specific parts of the brain. This illustrates how the idea of brain mapping beyond a generality is not an accurate understanding of the brain. There can be no map of the brain beyond a general depiction because there is no standard brain. Each brain is unique. We can begin to see what and how an infant interacts with technology will have shaping force on its brain development. Researchers have become interested in how linear, page 1 to 10 style, media and nonlinear, like web page hyperlinks, is shaping the brain and how we think. The media that we interact with teaches us symbolically and analogically how to organize and think about the world. In a recent study reported in The Telegraph, experts are observing addiction-like brain imaging and images in brain imaging and behavior in toddlers who use touchscreen computers. Contemporary research on neuroplasticity can be said to have begun with Wilder Penfield. He discovered that electrical stimulation on the cerebral cortex resulted in sensory hallucinations or involuntary muscle movement. In the 1960s, Michael Merzenich was investigating the effect of brain lesions on the sensory system of monkeys. He found that the brain would repair itself, not unlike the lesions on the skin repair itself. In the 1970s, a biologist named Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize for work done illustrating the changes in the nervous system of slugs after learning. In a more disturbing and more recent research project, Edward Taub, director of the Institute for Behavioral Research in Silver Spring, Maryland, illustrated that severed neural tissues do regenerate. After an undercover investigation by Alex Pacheco, founder of the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Taub was charged with 113 counts of animal cruelty. He was convicted of 6 counts, which were overturned on appeal. Dr. Taub continues to teach at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Musicians are always of interest to neuroscientists, primarily because they spend a great deal of time developing a specific brain area. In fact, before Taub researched monkeys, he discovered that violinists had higher concentration of neural clusters on the right frontal cortex, the area of the brain that corresponds with the left hand, which violinists use to finger the instrument. Harvard professor of neurology Alvaro Pasqualeone compared a group of piano students who practiced a piece on the piano versus a group of students who imagined practicing the piece. Through brain imaging, he found that identical areas of the brain are developed regardless of whether the students physically or mentally practiced the music. 2 thinkers in particular will serve as the conscious of our exploration into this mediated and technological phenomenon. One is Friedrich Nietzsche. He warned against a world that was losing its enchantment and its mysticism at the hands of science and logic. The other is Erich Fromm, and he warned that in the 19th century the problem was that God was dead, and in the 20th century he said the problem is that man is dead. We will see that Nietzsche and Fromm's warnings are not obsolete. In fact, Jaron Lanier, the person who coined the term virtual reality, has warned when you have a global mush, people lose their identity. They become pseudonyms. They have no consequence in what they do. We will become the conscious of our post-industrial technological world in a way that will allow us to determine for ourselves if in fact man is dead.